In Senegal, in Mauritania, as well as neighboring Gambia, which is also an important source of migration, and Guinea as well. Big proportion of their population is young, very big. I guess you guys have seen the statistics, like demographically, Africa is booming, and there's just not enough money and not enough jobs for those people.
Many refugees who are posting a lot, still being in asylum procedure, but posting things that indicate sorta that they already achieved some kind of a success. It's a lot of like pictures in front of shopping malls, nice cars and things like this. They do not write that those are not their cars, or that going to a shopping mall is just going there, not necessarily shopping fancy things, right? But it sends a message back home to show people that there are possibilities like this in Europe when they do not necessarily have it in Senegal.
Those guys here on the ground in Senegal and Mauritania are just those small middlemen. Like, we actually don't know who is running those smuggling networks, but they have been growing and they have become much more professionalized. And we have like people from Asia going through West Africa to get to Europe, which is quite insane if you look at the map.
Yes, absolutely. Welcome back to Fractured by Refocus Media Labs. It's almost the end of season 4. Remember, there are so many episodes you can still watch. But before we go on the summer break, we have several more underreported stories for you. And one of those really important topics that we would like to cover today is the topic of West Africa, refugees, asylum seekers from West Africa, with this special focus on Senegal. And we have an expert with us today to speak about this region, Monika Pronczuk, who is a West and Central Africa correspondent at the Associated Press, currently in Dakar. You're connecting with us, right, from Dakar?
Yes, hi. Thanks for having me. I am indeed in Dakar, yes.
In Dakar with horrible heat, just as us here. So I'm gonna cut right to the topic. Monika, we want to talk about the situation of refugees and asylum seekers coming from West Africa and Senegal, particularly, because it's a very underreported topic here for our audience. Most of our audience comes from Germany, some from Poland. We have American and UK listeners and people who watch. And the topics that they are very interested in are predominantly refugees coming to Europe from crossing the Mediterranean. Here we have a different situation. So to start, I would like you to give us a little bit an overview of what is happening in this region. How many refugees are coming, or asylum seekers and migrants are coming? What are the trends in Western Africa?
So yeah, I mean, it is a very, very important migration route. Senegal and Mauritania are sort of the hubs for migration from the whole region. So we are having a special focus in Senegal, and this is where the so-called pirogues, which are the fishing boats where the migrants take to go to the Canary Islands, this is where they depart from here in Mauritania. But the nationalities are from all over the region. And so actually in the first quarter of 2025, this route, which is called the Atlantic route, was the most popular and the deadliest route between Africa and Europe. And there are like multiple reasons, but basically the numbers, I think, tripled in 2023 and 2024 compared to previous years. I mean, then 2020 and 2021 obviously were very different because of COVID. But in general, there has been sort of like an increasing, a steady increasing trend in the popularity of this route. And the Central Mediterranean route, the numbers have dropped last year, like by 59%. And so all those people who are taking the Central Mediterranean route or would want to, it doesn't mean that all of them have given up on going to Europe. It's just that they're looking for other options. So there are like multiple factors. There's the situation in Tunisia and Libya, with in both of those countries, is the situation for migrants, sub-Saharan migrants, is just truly awful. There are reports of rights violations, harassment,
even basically kidnapping and selling people on basically slavery markets almost.
So yeah, I mean, this is why people are not very keen on using that route. And so they decide, often advised by their like local smugglers, to take the other route. And interestingly, so in the past, it always used to be the majority of people taking this route were Senegalese or Mauritanian, but mostly Senegalese. And actually, this year and last year is the first time that the majority is from a different country, from Mali. And that's because of there is like a really, really big crisis in Mali right now, with extremist groups linked to Al Qaeda and the Islamic State taking over larger and larger swaths of the territory. And what goes with it is like an extremely dire humanitarian crisis. So people from Mali are migrating massively. And instead of choosing the central Mediterranean route because it's too dangerous, they are going through Senegal.
Monika, so you touched a little bit about those push factors. You spoke about Mali. How about the situation in Senegal and Mauritania? What causes this migration or the fact that people really want to leave those countries?
So in Senegal, in Mauritania, as well as neighboring Gambia, which is also an important source of migration, and Guinea as well. I mean, Guinea is a bit more complex. So let's say those three countries, it's mostly economic factors. So there is just not enough jobs. These countries have, in big proportion of their population is young, very big. I guess you guys have seen the statistics, like demographically, Africa is booming, and there's just not enough money and not enough jobs for those people to sustain themselves and their families. So
not many investments.
Yeah, and there's also the issue of, I mean, that's like a separate discussion that's also linked, but the fact that African countries are mostly just exporters of resources, and they don't really produce much because of the lack of infrastructure. So in Senegal, a very chunk of population used to rely on fishing and kind of the industry around it. So fish processing, working in ports, etc. And this has become more complicated in recent years for like many reasons that we can dive into after. But a lot of people who are migrating are from the fishing communities. And if you look at the major departure points in Senegal, they're mostly sort of located in the fishing communities. Even here in the suburbs of Dakar, I've visited several of them for like different stories. It's really not far, but it's really not far geographically, but it's a very, very different reality than the center of Dakar. And there is like a small percentage of people that live very well. There is a growing middle class in Senegal, but it's still like very small compared to sort of the rest of the population. And most of the population is relatively poor. And so when I was speaking to people that want to migrate and like was hanging out in their neighborhoods, they would tell me like, okay, look at this house. It's someone who went to Spain and basically worked there for a year on a minimum wage, like was sustaining himself and sending some money back to their family, and they managed to build a house in 1 year. And they were like, for us, if we stay in Senegal, like we will not make it in a lifetime. So even though this route is very deadly, people keep on kind of risking their lives, especially young people and especially men. Although interestingly, more women are also starting to migrate recently. But like I said, sort of traditionally, it's like young men who are, just like risk takers.
Yeah, yeah. Easier. And very frequently there's this notion that I'm going to go as the first one and get a job and prepare something, and maybe then I will get the family back. But people also have those, success stories in front of their eyes. You mentioned the house, but we also observe it here with many refugees who are posting a lot, still being in asylum procedure, but posting things that indicate sorta that they already achieved some kind of a success. It's a lot of like pictures in front of shopping malls, nice cars and things like this. They do not write that those are not their cars, or that going to a shopping mall is just going there, not necessarily shopping fancy things, right? But it sends a message back home to show people that there are possibilities like this in Europe when they do not necessarily have it in Senegal. We have those statistics I just checked for yesterday. So this year, so since the beginning of 2025, a little bit more than 6,500 people reached mainland Spain, but almost 11,500 reached the Canary Islands alone. So much more to the Canary Islands than mainland Spain. And this is the place where Canary Islands, where people from those regions we are talking about are coming, right? So this is the route through the Atlantic. Are all the people from, let's say, Senegal, Gambia going to Canary Island, or are they somehow managing to go straight to the mainland Spain?
Not really. I mean, from what I know, this is like the main route. In Gambia, I have also encountered people that tried the Central Mediterranean route through Libya and Tunisia, but I think like the message really has that was a year ago when I was in Gambia reporting on that, and I think the message has really spread since then that this is like not worth it, and it's people that I spoke to were like really really traumatized. So that's kind of links nicely to what you were talking about. So it is actually called TikTok migration here in the region, uh, and this is why it's like people in this region really rely on what others tell them, like others in the community. So this is like the issue. There was a lot of attempts at doing some sort of information campaigns about how dangerous this route is, and like how also uncertain the outcome is, right? Because I mean, we're gonna get into that, but like once you reach the shores of the Canary Islands, it doesn't actually mean anything, right? So and that have mostly, those campaigns have mostly failed because they were organized from above. It's really like for people living, like people in West Africa live much more in communities than we do in Europe. Like the community, the family, and larger, the community is the most important. So it has like, there are two sides to it. First of all, there is a lot of social pressure actually on those young men to go to provide for their families, and even if they're not married, but for like their mothers and their aunts, like really extended families. Like once someone has some sort of income, they're expected to sustain like many people with it. So there's a pressure to do that, and so if they cannot find a way to do it in their own country, then they feel the pressure to leave, so take this risk. And then yes, the sort of the word of mouth is what counts most. So either through social media or through what your neighbor told you. So I do think that this is why those people get sucked into those streams, right? And they don't really think, oh, what can be like an alternative route, or what can I do differently? They're sucked into this stream. And also that's another aspect, and I know you also wanted to talk about that, the smugglers network became much better organized. Like this is a completely different level than like 10 years ago. We had we are hearing reports of people from Pakistan going through this route to get to Europe. And those guys here on the ground in Senegal and Mauritania are just those small middlemen. Like we actually don't know who is running those smuggling networks, but they have been growing and they have become much more professionalized. And we have like people from Asia going through West Africa to get to Europe, which is quite insane if you look at the map.
Yes, absolutely. Monika, I will definitely go back to the topic of the smugglers because it is really, really interesting. But I would like to stay a little bit longer on those factors, namely the overfishing. I would like to recommend to everybody a film by our friend Gosia Juszczyk, who made a film about overfishing in Gambia. It's called Stolen Fish. I'm not sure if it's fully available everywhere because it went to several film festivals recently. But she shows there what a big push factor overfishing is in a tiny country like Gambia, right? Many people have lived for generations of those fish. This was the one job that everybody was like passing from father to a son, and suddenly there are no fish. And I would like to ask if you were observing exactly the same thing in Senegal or maybe Mauritania as well, or is this on a lower level and is just one of the factors, not the main one?
Well, I think in Senegal it's definitely a very big factor. Not sure about Mauritania because there are less people in Mauritania, like percentage-wise, that rely on fishing and like the industry around fishing than in Senegal. But in Senegal, I mean, that's clear. And so what happened is that they're just like more, it's a big simplification because it is a complex topic, but there are just more and more foreign vessels that are fishing and fishing illegally in the places where they're not supposed to be fishing. So there are zones that are supposed to be exclusively for artisanal fishing. So when you think about fishermen in Senegal, like you have to know that they have like the artisanal fishermen. They don't really have a lot of equipment infrastructure. They have those like long wooden fishing boats that are called pirogues, and they usually fish with nets or there are some that kind of dive to fish, but this is a minority. And so because of the foreign vessels, but because also of the fact that for a long time fishing was not regulated in Senegal, which means that everyone, was just fishing, including the artisanal fishermen. People were just like fishing as they wanted to. And obviously climate change and global warming and pollution. And so all of that put together means that there's just not as many fish as there used to be in the ocean. And so if you add to that like new actors, which are the foreign vessels, and a new development that we're seeing is also like foreign fishing companies that get vessels that are kind of flagged as Senegalese. So they enter into some sort of joint venture with Senegalese companies, and then they can, be marked as Senegalese. And then there are different rules that apply to them, but they still have like just more resources. And they're mostly Chinese, some Russians, some Europeans, but the European ones are mostly fishing legally because, I mean, now they stopped because actually the fishing agreement between EU and Senegal has been suspended. But it is like a big rumor here also in the fishing community that it's mostly like European, or that like European vessels are very active. But actually, if you dive into the data, like at least for the last couple of years, that's not true. That probably happened earlier in the past with the previous agreements, or when there were no agreements at all yet. But like actually the most recent agreement with the EU was very detailed and strict in terms of what and where the European vessels could have fished. And actually I should have gotten the numbers, but I don't have them in my head, but it was a very small percentage of what the overall fishing stock in Senegal. But if you go to those fishing communities, however, everyone will tell you that they are leaving because foreign vessels, but they will mention Europeans as well, are coming and fishing. So there's also, like as with TikTok migration, when people are showing sort of not their reality, but what they want to see, there's just a lot of disinformation. I mean, like everywhere, but it's sort of around the fishing and migration.
So are there now any regulations on that, on fishing? In terms of Gambia, I know that it is predominantly Chinese vessels that overfish in this region, but there are not many, at least there weren't last year, regulations that would decide how much you can actually fish. And I don't know if there's something like this in Senegal.
Yes, they actually, so they do have regulations. The problem, and the regulations I think are actually quite like reasonable. The bigger problem is that those regulations are not being enforced,
implemented.
And it's not even about respected. They're not being enforced. So Senegal has a new government, and they have, I mean, it's relatively new. Let's say like less than a year or a little bit over a year. And so one of the promises they made was to crack down on corruption and like kind of renegotiate contracts with foreign companies, etc., in order to bring more benefits from natural resources, including fishing, to the Senegalese population. But if you actually look into the data, it like lots of the fishing or the overfishing that's happening is sort of the illegal, unregulated fishing. So it's not the ones, it's not the vessels that actually fish according to the rules, but it's the ones that like don't care about the rules. And the issue is that like not much is being done with it, and it's mostly because of corruption, probably. So this is something that like that the Senegalese government promised to work on. We haven't like seen much, for the moment, but the regulations are in place. They're just not enforced.
Do you think that the problem is well known in Europe? So if we're complaining about more refugees and migrants coming from this region, do you think there is an understanding of the problem among European policymakers, people who have some power over this process?
I mean, the fishing problem or the migration problem?
The fishing in connection with the migration, like migration caused by the fishing, overfishing.
On the EU level, this issue is quite, people do understand it, like those people that like work on it, but they are the ones working on the fishing agreements, right? They're not the ones working on migration policies. I think the challenge here is that as it is mostly Chinese, and actually I just found the numbers, like this is like declared fishing, right? So this is not the undeclared fishing, but this is what's kind of legal, and according to the rules is that there were 80 Chinese vessels that were registered and 18 from the whole of the EU. But that's like the legal ones, right? And then like if you take the illegal ones, it's mostly Chinese. So I think what's problematic is to make this make a straightforward connection between overfishing and migration if the overfishing right now is mostly done by the Chinese trawlers, right? But overall, I think there's a very deep lack of understanding sort of on a population level in Europe about the reality of like everyday reality of people in West Africa and sort of the challenges, the economic challenges that they face. I think the issue of overfishing has become sort of more prominent in recent years. I feel there's like more documents, more European journalists are interested in it, and they're like kind of digging more into the problem. And there was a crackdown on sort of the European vessels, but that doesn't solve the bigger issue, which is countries that are not bound by the EU rules, and it's, I would say, what's more sort of what's kind of prominent here is the general the general sort of lack of understanding and knowledge of the economic situation of West Africa, and how 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 deeply it lacks in infrastructure. We keep hearing like, oh, like both from the governments of African countries and of European countries, like, oh, we want African countries to be like self-sufficient, and like, aid is not great because it puts them in a position of a victim. But it is very difficult to do that without factories, without roads, without refineries. Like, if the only thing you do is you export raw materials, then like you're never going to be self-sufficient. And that's kind of, I'd say that is the issue that is very misunderstood among European societies. And how much actually Europe also has benefited economically in the last 100 years, from Africa's natural resources, including the fish. But I'd say it's like larger than that.
Definitely a larger topic. Monika, going back to the smugglers network, how big or even gigantic role do they play in actually moving people, not only from Senegal or Mauritania, as you're saying, but like people from other countries in the region? How do they operate in general? How does it look like?
So actually, the smugglers network is something that's been quite underreported in the media. So we know sort of like generally, but it's hard to know the specifics. Like, obviously we know the prices because this is like what people pay, and we know how much the captains of those little boats get paid. But
okay. So
how much
does it cost? How much does it cost?
So if you are Senegalese, let me get out the numbers. If you are Senegalese, like, it will cost you between 400 and 700 euros for one time trying. And it really depends on the type of the boat, on whether you're a child or whether you're an adult, on your relationship with the person who's organizing the boat, right? Because there are sort of two types. There's of smuggler networks. I mean, in the past, you mainly used to have like people from the neighborhoods from the same neighborhood that would decide like, okay, we want to go to Europe. And then they would kind of group their resources and like either buy a pirogue or usually like buy or build a pirogue that they would use to go to Europe. That was in the past. Like, obviously, as it works with capitalism, someone saw an opportunity and was like, oh, okay, I can like make it work. So for myself to make money. So it was growing exponentially. Like, it started from those groups, and then as it became bigger, and as people from other regions and from other countries started using this route, there were more intermediaries involved, and also obviously there was a need for more boats if more people wanted to go. So someone needed to be there with the capital to buy those boats or to build those boats. So this is how it kind of started out. And so right now, this is kind of what you're paying as an adult Senegalese person. If you're not Senegalese, the prices are much higher, but you also sometimes pay for a part of the journey from your home country. But it really depends where you're coming from, right? Like, if but it is around 1,000 for someone who's not Senegalese. And in Mauritania, the prices are much higher. It's a good question why. I think it's because maybe there's more people from other countries coming to Mauritania, so they were like, okay, we can charge more. But it's around 1,000, 1,500. It can even go up to 1,800 according to like some reporting from March this year. And so, yeah, I mean, usually the way it starts is you know know of someone who went to Europe, or and you kind of ask them how they did it, or there sometimes are guys that are coming to your neighborhood and saying, oh, I have a way if you want to go to Europe. You usually don't talk about it to many people. A lot of people I spoke to didn't even tell their families, so their families would just like wake up and realize that they're not there, because the departures take place usually very, very early in the morning or in the night, but usually very early in the morning. And so you kind of don't talk about it in order not to jinx it. People get jealous also of people who go to Europe, and you keep it in secret, and then you just leave. And it's kind of like, to me, it was shocking to hear those stories that like, oh, I am a mother and I woke up one day and my son was gone. And obviously it was very hard on the mother, but she was not shocked. Like she was like, the situation is so bad and so many people are leaving, that this is like something that I was kind of psychologically prepared for. Like this scale of young people that have left those communities is like really massive. Like those poor fishing communities in Senegal specifically that I'm talking about now. When I will go, if I go and stand with someone on the beachfront, and they will just point to all the houses that all the households where a member has gone to Europe. It's basically like 90% of the households, and then households where someone died on their way to Europe, it would be like 20%. Like it's just like very um it's just a very significant number. And it's especially as it's young people, like it also is hard on the communities. When I went to schools and I would ask people, like kids, young teenagers or around 10 years old, like who's planning on taking a pirogue and going to Europe, like almost everyone would like raise their hand in front of their teachers. And like the teachers would also say like, oh, we just like one day we have like this student is not coming to class anymore, and we just assume that they tried to go to Europe. So the scale is really, really impressive.
And the fact that those are small communities, and as you said, communities are very important. The fact that they know that people died, there's no message, no information from them from the other side. Is this not scaring them, stopping them from taking the journey?
That's a great question that I always ask when I speak to them. And so to young Senegalese people who want to migrate. And so first of all, there is this thinking that like it's not going to happen to me. These are like young people who are restless, who are not afraid of taking risk. And then there's also a cultural issue, which I observe sort of everywhere, not just when it comes to migration. Like in Europe, we like to think we are really in control of our lives and of what happens to us. And here's the other extreme. So it's what people say here is like, inshallah, God willing. So it's like there is this idea that our destiny is written somewhere, and if you have to die on a pirogue, you're gonna die on a pirogue. And obviously I'm like oversimplifying here, but before I came here, I didn't realize how much this approach was important also in the migration debate. Like I did, to me it was like, okay, your friend died, like why are you going? And so it's inshallah, it's a mixture of like desperation because there is nothing for them here, social pressure, but also this idea like in any case we're not in control, right? Like, so if I'm supposed to die, if I stay in Senegal, or if I leave, I'm gonna die. So yeah, that's like a mix. There is I met some really, really endearing and impressive characters, like people who are trying to convince others not to leave. So there's this sort of grassroots work that's being done.
What is their motivation? Is this a mission of their NGO to do so, or is this a personal mission?
So I think there are like plenty of small NGOs, but I would say like they're really like the sort of more grassroots community NGOs. They're not like the NGOs like sent from the West to do that. The two people I met, both of them had their own, yes, NGOs, but yeah, just like little organizations, and both of them went on pirogues themselves and like almost died and survived. And then they were like, okay, we're gonna try to. It was a very horrible experience for them, and they decided to kind of try to spare other young people from going through that. This one guy, he was one of he went on one of the first pirogues that went to Spain in 2006, and so he even made it to Spain, but then he got like put in a detention center, and like on the way, I think 4 out of the 30 people who were on the pirogue died. And it's also, that's very gruesome because you actually have to throw the bodies out into the sea in order for others not to, get diseases, or because we actually haven't talked about the journey. And the journey itself is usually very tough.
We have to remember, because everybody's always saying that the Mediterranean is the graveyard, basically right now, one of the deadliest paths. But this is the ocean, open ocean water. That's a completely different level of danger.
Totally. And like, if you think about what kind of boats they're taking, which is mostly those wooden fishing boats, a lot of them, they know how to fish and like stay around the coast, but they don't know how to navigate those boats in open waters. There's like lots of currents. That the ocean, I mean, we know it's very treacherous. Like the weather can change like that. Some of those pirogues get lost for like days. Then people like die of thirst, or exhaustion, or of hunger. So it's not just because they would collapse and people would die. Like people would also die because they just lose their way, and they kind of count on their GPS, but there's no phone service out in the open ocean. And the captains of those boats are usually people from communities themselves. Like no professional smuggler will like risk their lives and go on the boat with the migrants. So they are paid. Sometimes they're paid, and sometimes they get a discount, or they can go for free. And what's really interesting is that they are the only people that then can get prosecuted.
Yeah,
they're the only ones that are like legally liable. And so that's important, because both Senegal and Mauritania recently really increased the crackdown on the boats and on irregular migration. Also different topic, but we can maybe talk about it a bit later, because of the pressure from the EU. And so the result, but it's very hard to crack down on the smuggling networks. So in the end, who gets like put into jail are the captains. And so these are usually like people from communities who, are not actual professional smugglers themselves. And there is this really like tragic story that's been in the Senegalese media recently. There was a big pirogue accident. I think it was late last year. A lot of people died from one community, and they arrested the captain, and the captain has been now charged. I think he's been charged with manslaughter, and he's been put to jail. The thing is, this captain himself lost like 3 members of his family on this pirogue, because he was just one of the guys that were trying to get to Europe. So no one else was held responsible for this. Like, obviously, it's much harder to get the big smugglers. And so that's sort of the smuggling situation.
Yeah, so the same thing is happening here. I mean, it's been happening for years. And just yesterday, I saw, and I managed to find it right now, a report by Free Humanitarians, how they were reporting on how many so-called smugglers are currently in Greek prison system. And they're claiming it's the second largest group of prisoners in the whole Greece. It's one in
Wow.
5 prisoners is actually accused of smuggling in Greece. That's a gigantic number. 1 in 5. It's been happening for years. It's not such a big topic anymore because we don't have those big trials. Usually the big trials happens when one of the accused is European or has some like larger connections, or the name is well known, like this Free Humanitarians trial with Sara Mardini, who's a swimmer. But it is happening, and it's a very worrying trend that people like in government and prosecution do not really see. And it's not only I'm sorry to say it, but it's not only about innocent people being in prison, but also not tackling the big problem, the big smugglers, right? But Monika, we started on the topic of this change on the borders, and we saw some trends in how European Union, for example, is changing its policy on migration right now with the externalization of border security and border control. And so here, for example, of course, Turkey has a deal with EU, Libya has a deal with EU, and for quite a lot of money, they're sort of securing their borders better. But I think it was last year that Mauritania also signed a deal with the EU for 210 million euros. And to my understanding, the main thing for them is to just stop the smugglers' networks from operating in the Mauritanian coast and launching for Spain. Is this correct?
Yeah, I mean the interesting thing about those deals is that it is very difficult to track down exactly how that money is being spent. So, we kind of have the general text of the agreements, and we know that the idea is that's put on paper is to kind of stop irregular migration. But then to like actually see what is happening with that money is very complicated. For sure, one thing that the EU is doing is like helping with the infrastructure. Like also in Senegal, they helped with getting like the patrol vessels and like training of border control guards, and there is like this kind of more transparent part, but like in all of those deals there is the part where it's just very difficult to trace the money. But to be completely fair, after spending 5 years in Brussels before reporting on the EU, in general there are many projects when it's like difficult to find the data, but there are like different types of EU financial support, and so a lot of those deals kind of work on them or are based on sort of the direct support to governments. So like the governments, then they have to get it somehow approved by the EU, but they have more like freedom and liberty in deciding how they're going to spend the money. And I think one of the issue that like rights groups have raised about those agreements is apart from obviously the debate of externalization of like migration management, which is a bigger debate, but a lot of those governments are authoritarian and have been accused of breaching human rights. And so there is the sort of the ethical debate whether it is ethical to give money to the government of Tunisia, who's been accused of breaching human rights, and of kind of participating in this kind of treatment of migrants that we've discussed before. So yeah, I think this is the situation for sure. These governments need some sort of support because they just don't have enough resources. But yeah, I mean, then we get into the whole discussion of root causes of migration, right? Like, and that's just like a really really separate issue. But on those agreements, I think this is what I'd say is that.
So, Monika, you have this really interesting perspective because you spent 5 years reporting from Brussels and then you moved to Senegal. That's a pretty big shift in your career, but also in topics you were covering. How did this change your personal view on migration and issues in this region?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think I was like pretty aware of the realities, and I mean, this is also why I decided to move to Senegal, is because I wanted to explore it more and understand better the sort of situation on the ground. I have I've always sort of reported on the EU migration policy with this, having had the experience of also reporting from different borders. So before coming to Brussels, but also while I was in Brussels, I reported from the Polish-Belarusian border, from the Polish-Ukrainian border, before I reported from the Balkans, from Greece. So I think it is important to have both perspectives as a journalist, to kind of be able to show, you know, the reality behind the numbers and behind the data, and also the impact of certain policies on the ground. I think it, you know, it made me more conscious of how like complicated and nuanced this issue is, right? Like it's not black and white. You really see sort of the complete like collapse of the global asylum system when you're here on the ground, because let's face it, I mean, Senegalese people who sometimes have very legitimate reasons for leaving, they shouldn't be applying for asylum under the current rules, right? Like there should be like some sort of a different system for them, but there's none. And there's no possibility for anyone in Senegal to apply for, or like it's very, very complicated to apply. Well, it's impossible to apply for asylum in embassies, and it's very, very complicated to apply for visas because the waiting times are very long and the rejections rate are very high, etc. And so they're kind of left with this one option, but that's not really like suitable to their situation, because, you know, unless we expand the definition of an asylum seeker, you know, they are they are not refugees in the classical sense of the word. Then like with Malians you can discuss, but I think it really yeah showed me that, like, made me realize that that the system we have in place right now is just not like not fit to the current reality. And one more thing is that we have such a problem with labor. I mean, in Europe, we just don't have enough people to do a lot of physical jobs that Europeans do not want to do, and people here are really keen to do them. And there is like a mismatch, right? And there have been like a number of initiatives that try to address that, to do some sort of like circular migration programs or like legal migration programs to work for like specific companies for a specific period of time. But it's not really like working, and it's also because like majority of people that use that schemes overstayed their visas and stayed back in Europe illegally. So it's, you know, it's just it's very, very interesting to see how it is going to be shaped in the future. And I feel that there is, you know, that this kind of also distinction between a migrant and a refugee has been like blurring in the last years because of climate change. Like what you see here is like how much climate change is impacting movements of people. But one thing I really wanted to highlight is that like we like no one realizes in Europe, but like over 90% of migration here is happening in the region. Like it's really just like the minority of people. We talk about them because they're the ones who kind of like disturb our peace in Europe. But the majority are just like moving from one country to another country because they either do not have the money or the motivation or, just like the knowledge that they could go get on a pirogue and go to Europe. And so actually, even in terms of refugees, not just economic migrants that want to move somewhere because they want to work, but refugees that you have to like support and like create facilities for them. Like it is mostly the burden of the governments here. Like right now, there's a massive humanitarian crisis going on in the Sahel. There are millions of refugees from Burkina Faso and from Mali inside the region. And it is on the governments from the region to help them and support them. And if you go to Abidjan, which is sort of the economic hub of the region, you have all nationalities, like all taxi drivers are Burkinabe or club bouncers are like Malian. So it is not at all this vision that people in Europe often have, which is like, oh, everyone from Africa wants to come to Europe. That's not the case at all. And I think this is something that's like often lost.
Thank you very much for saying this, because we've been repeating it for so many years now. All the data, all the stats, everywhere you see this information, and people just do not believe that. They really think that we're the center of the world. Why wouldn't everybody want to come to Europe, right? Monika, to end, I really, really need to ask you a question about your work, meaning the practical side of it. As a journalist in the region, and I'm going to ask you about a broader region, about Sahel, because this is a dangerous place right now. How do you report? How dangerous is it? I know, and I would like to recommend to everybody your last article on the Wagner's group. I can only imagine that it's not an easy topic to report on. So how do you do it? What are your ways, and and how dangerous is it for you?
Well, it is extremely challenging to report on the region, especially on Sahel. And I mean, the access for journalists has just been shrinking. But even since I'm here, I've been here just a little bit over a year, and I've seen sort of possibilities of reporting from the region like shrink. I was able to go to Burkina Faso in November. I think I would not probably, even my bosses probably would not like let me go right now, because the situation is deteriorating so quickly. And so a lot of reporting that we do is we do it through open source reporting, through social media, trying to, and obviously verify it, but trying to, get to people on the ground, but to communicate with them in a secure manner is very, very difficult. And it is mostly dangerous for people on the ground. When I went to Burkina Faso, my main concern was that I could put people that I'm interviewing in danger, or my local colleagues that I'm working with in danger, because I mean, there is a threat of like being detained by the government, and that actually happened to one of my colleagues in Burkina Faso, also in the capital, because no one leaves the capital anymore because it's too dangerous. But I have a European passport. Like I can always just like get on a plane and leave, and that's not the case for our local colleagues, who are incredibly brave, and they're doing an amazing work. And I'd say you have to assess the risk on a case-by-case basis, because sometimes it just might not be worth it for you to take the risk, or for your local colleague to take the risk. But at the same time, you have to balance it out, because it is insane what is happening in Sahel, and we don't know about it in Europe. Like the scale of like atrocities against civilians, the scale of the humanitarian crisis, especially now after the US aid cuts, the hunger rates are skyrocketing. I mean, school feeding programs in Mali are completely just stopped from one day to another. There are millions of IDPs in Burkina Faso that were relying on US aid money to get water, for example. And we cannot even report on that because we cannot go into those places because of this like double threat. There is a threat from the military juntas, from the government, and the threat from the Islamist groups. So obviously as a white person, you're more of a target for the Islamist groups. I was planning a trip to Mali, and it's been cancelled for the moment because of, I don't know if you guys followed, but in the recent weeks there have been like really a wave of attacks. So it was supposed to be organized with one of the UN agencies, and they said like they're not going to do it because they're afraid for my safety, but also for their safety. So it's you have to be creative, and even, you know, just one thing I wanted to highlight is like the most danger, like the people who are really the most in danger are like our local colleagues and local sources. And so this is also tough because you have to navigate between, my job as a journalist is like, you know, to bring information to people and to tell stories, but I strongly believe that like no story is worth like someone's life. So but there's just like a whole range of challenges that we don't face in Europe at all. All the paperwork, accreditations, visas, and the fact that like, yeah, as a journalist, you're always a suspect here. Like, and by here, I really mean, I would mainly say the countries that are ruled by the military juntas. But even in Ivory Coast, I've had an experience where it was because I wanted to report on sensitive topics on jihadism spilling through the border with Burkina. It was possible, but it was also challenging. So yeah.
No, Monika, we like keep our fingers crossed for your safety and more interesting stories to come. Thank you very much for being with us today, putting some light on those important topics. And I would very much like you back on the podcast to discuss more about Sahel and more about the intervention of Wagner's group in this region. It's so underreported. I know you've been reporting a lot about this, but let's be honest, not everybody's reading to Associated Press, right? Or New York Times. So the more we can push the topic, the better. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. Thank you.
Thank you very much for listening and watching. We will have 2 more episodes for you this season before we go to our summer shorts, which are always shorter. So maybe a little bit more going towards this summertime on the beach. So check out our past episodes and we'll see you in 1 week.